And there we go. The video is live. So just we'll just take a few moments waiting for people to jump on and so we can say hi and see who's going to participate, who's going to jump on here, because we're talking about the desert mothers. That's the topic of choice today, the desert mothers. So I'm just gonna take a second here and share the video and let people know that we're live. And there we go. So, yes. So, welcome to this kind of impromptu live stream. For those of you that have been following some of our posts and some of what we've been talking about the last few weeks or so, you may have an inkling of what we're going to talk about today. But thought let's go live. Let's talk about it. So just first off, take a second, comment, let me know who's jumping on, who's on here. So that we're going to talk about these enigmatic figures that we find in the early Christian centuries, the early church centuries. And so great to see you, Desmond. Thank you for jumping on. So for those of you that are maybe just great to see Brenda. For those of you that are just kind of joining, some people have been following along with what we've been doing, and so you're familiar with some of the great Desmond, wonderful, from London, England. Love that. Great to see you jumping on here. And most of the time when we go live, it's been maybe a few weeks, but we go live, we're doing dream interpretation, maybe answering spiritual questions about the spiritual life, that kind of stuff. And but we've got an exciting thing that we've just announced in the last week or so, and that is that we have published 5 more devotionals, drawing from the inspiration from the early Christian monastics. And so for some of you know that we've done a number of devotionals we put out. We've been writing about the Desert Fathers, which was an early church movement from the 3rd century to the 6th century, roughly to the 6th century. The early church movement, really the catalyst was Anthony the Great and men and women going into the desert to essentially escape society and form communal living to seek Christ in places of solitude and silence where there's no distractions, that kind of stuff. So I mean, there's a lot more to it than that, but that's kind of in a nutshell what we're talking about. And so you had this early church movement that drew people away from the kind of decadent lifestyles you saw in the Greek and the Roman society of the time, to gather in small communities that practiced the spiritual life, practiced renouncing oneself, laying one's life down, loving one another, that kind of stuff. And so that kind of went through into about the 6th century AD. We're talking 500 years after the life of Jesus, until it really had so infiltrated the culture of the church that it become commonplace. So we say it lasted from the 3rd to the 6th century. And what we mean by that is that not that it ended, but that it had become kind of de facto. Monasteries were commonplace, Christian monastics were commonplace, and it became kind of the training grounds for a lot of actually who became the men and women that became, or the men that became priests and bishops. And so in that period of time, in the 3rd to the 6th century, one of the things that struck me as I started studying the lives of the early monastics was just how many times women were referenced, and that women held a significant part to play in this early movement. And as I was studying some of the lives of the early church women, and I came across a few women, one of them being Melania the Elder. Melania the Elder was she was an aristocratic birth, born in Rome, very wealthy family, and had tons of money, that kind of stuff. And she ended up selling. She encounters Jesus, and long story short, but she ends up selling all of her possessions and flees from Rome because essentially the emperor wants to keep the resources of her family. Her her husband died when she was young, and so the emperor wants to keep the resources of the family in Rome. So she has to kind of flee by cover of night, but she expunges all of her assets, basically takes all of the money with her and begins distributing it throughout her life to the monks that the monasteries and the churches in Egypt, into Palestine, into all the way up into Turkey, and into Israel, which is where the monastic communities were all gathered around. And millennia became, it was said by the end of her life, something to the effect that there's not a single practicing Christian monastic that hadn't in some way been touched by the generosity of millennia, because she's given away so much resources. So you hear a story like that and you go, my goodness, this woman had a significant part to play in an incredible reformation and revival in church history. And so we hear a lot about the practices of someone like Anthony the Great, who was a catalyst for the whole thing happening. But maybe we hear a little bit less about someone like Melania the Elder, who was also a catalyst for the sustenance and growth of the whole thing. Because we're talking millennia, we're talking maybe 100 years or 50 years after Anthony the Great. And then you have her daughter, her granddaughter, Melania the Younger, who was also incredibly influential. So you've got these stories that start to crop up in early church history about women that were significantly influential when it comes to the landscape of Christian monasticism. And it was said of Melania the Elder that she just absolutely devoured the works of Basil the Great and Gregory the Great, that she was a theological expert. And so anyway, you have a lot of significant influence there. And this is the case really when you study church history, throughout church history, that you notice that there a number of women continue to pop up in terms of the significance and the influence in who they are. And there's a concentrated amount really amongst it, so much so that the Desert Fathers are called also the Desert Mothers. But you have, even going further into 12th century, you can look at someone like Hildegard of Bingen was an incredibly influential figure who emperors and kings and leaders and priests and reached out to for prophetic insight and guidance and wisdom. You of course have some women like Julian of Norwich, another one who was a great mystical author in the Catholic tradition. You have Joan of Arc, of course, is another one. And you can go a little bit later, and you find someone like Teresa of Avila. So you've got a long line in terms of the history of women being influential in certain centuries, for sure. And walking very closely with, like Teresa of Avila walking very closely with John of the Cross, those two being kind of central figures for the Catholic view of the mystical life. Both of them, in their own right, being considered doctors in the Catholic Church. Teresa being the doctor of prayer, I think she's a doctor of prayer, and John is the doctor of mystical theology. I'm pretty sure that's what it is. But in any case, they're notable for their works and their teachings and what they wrote. So you're just looking at it and going, in Christian history, we have a significant amount of women that have been very influential, but we don't necessarily, at least in my evangelical charismatic circles, we don't necessarily remember them to celebrate them. So in the course of studying and researching the lives of the early monastics, one of the things that struck me was that when you come to the you're trying to find what kind of resources or what kind of works can you find from women in the not just the early church day, but in the broader culture and the context around the church at this point. And so you're looking at Greek philosophers and Roman philosophers, rhetoricians and teachers. What role did women play here? Because we have some historical evidence, of course, in history books, from the time of women. That great to see you, Laura. Um, you have some great evidence of women that served as not necessarily emperor, but de facto emperor, because maybe their children were in the line of emperors. And there's some women that were more influential in terms of the running of the Roman Empire than the actual emperors were. So we have women recorded in history in terms of their influence. But what do you see when it comes to teaching and philosophy and these kind of things, systems of thought, and can you find credible manuscripts and documents that still exist today that show us what some of the women in Roman society and Greek society taught? And the answer to that, as far as I've been able to find, is no, you can't. There's a couple of Greek philosophers that were notable women, and there's a couple of Roman philosophers that were notable women. But in terms of having a um, a body of work that we can attribute to a female philosopher from the Greek or the Roman times, you just can't find it. I haven't been able to find it anyway. Maybe someone can correct me, but I just haven't been able to find it. And I've looked. Um, and there's reasons for that that are beyond just the simple, well, they didn't write them down, because you had certain libraries that were destroyed in the from between the 1st to the 5th century, because of when the Gauls sacked Rome. There was one of the great libraries was destroyed then. So there's reasons why some of the manuscripts wouldn't exist beyond that. But with that said, you definitely can't find any, and you can find plenty from the men that were Greek and Roman philosophers. So for context sake, when you look at the historical evidence of manuscripts that have been preserved in history, you find that the Bible is the most well-preserved document in all of human history. There are about you know something like this. I don't know the exact particular number, but it's something like 20,000 manuscripts from early history that still exist today. You can find in some libraries somewhere, from anywhere from the 1st century to about the 10th century. You can find about 20,000 manuscripts of the Bible that still exist today. And there's consistency in translating between, because the manuscripts are in various different languages, that kind of stuff. So anyway, you can find lots of biblical manuscripts. You can find lots of manuscripts from Roman philosophers and Greek philosophers. The second most preserved historical work from the world of antiquity would be Homer's Odyssey, the writing of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And of Homer's Odyssey, there's about 800 manuscripts that still exist. Now, that's older than the Bible, because Homer wrote that about 600 or 700 years before the biblical manuscripts, but it was well produced and it was well circulated. So there would have been a lot of manuscripts around in the first few centuries AD. So Homer being the second most at 800, the Bible being the primary one at about 20,000. That's a pretty significant difference. So the fact of the matter is that manuscripts were preserved from the early days, and the fact that we see no Greek or Roman women philosophers which is the best comparison we'd have for the Christian monastics. People that taught their system of thought and their approach to the spiritual life, or approach to life in general, would be a Greek or a Roman philosopher. So when you come down to the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers, starting by the time you get into the 4th century, started by a woman named Amma Marcella in Rome in the late 3rd century, early 4th century. She was directly influenced by Anthony the Great, and she began monastic communities in the city of Rome for aristocratic women. And a lot of these aristocratic women ended up with their husbands passed away, or they entered into a life of chastity. Even if they were married, their husbands joined them in a commitment to Jesus to live a chaste life, basically, to not sleep with each other. And so, you had Marcella in the early 4th century, late 3rd century, being one of the more influential figures who essentially mentored some of the other women that became very notable in the Desert Father, Desert Mother movement. Um, and what you find now is that when you look at, say, kind of the if I usually have this right here with me. um, let's see, do I have the book, The Sayings of the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers, right in front of me? um anyway, it's somewhere back there. So when you look at the hey, Randy, great to see you. Jill, great to see you from London. Julian of Norwich lived in a small cell in Norwich Cathedral with her cat. Yes, that's true, she did, that's right. um so anyway, the when you look at the collection of sayings that kind of begins anybody's journey into the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers is, it's called the Apothegmata Patrum. It's the sayings of the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers. Apothegmata means the sayings of, and Patrum means sayings of the fathers. um, and so when you look at the collection, there's 131 names recorded. So it's full of short anecdotal statements that are kind of points of wisdom that would have been handed down teachings from various different figures. So 131 of them have been codified in this collection that's alphabetically laid out, according to the Greek alphabet, alphabetically laid out. And there's 128 of them are men and 3 of them are women. And on the outset, you look at that and you go, well, that's patriarchal, that's misogynistic. There's no role for women. There should be equality. You look at it through the modern political divisiveness lens that we have today. We go, okay, look at the patriarchal nature of Christianity. But the fact, when you compare it to the surrounding culture, the fact that there were 3 included in the sayings of the Desert Fathers, not as an asterisk, but right within the lineage, or right within the alphabetical um, listing, is not, well, okay, well, here's the women and here's the men. There's not some subcategory. They're right within the same collection that you'd find from the beginning when they started codifying these sayings. So the sayings of the Desert Mothers were just as equally codified and collected as the sayings of the fathers. And in fact, one of the larger chunk of sayings comes from one of the mothers, and her name was Amma Syncletica. Um, Jill, I really appreciate that. She says that the proper saying of Norwich, which I've been saying wrong, is Norwich. Okay, well, I will correct that. Thank you, Jill. Julian of Norwich. That's my North American nature coming out. Probably my Americanness coming out. And so Syncletica, there's about 10 to 15 pages worth of sayings in the sayings of the Desert Fathers and Mothers attributed to her. So the corpus of sayings that belong to her are, that's a pretty significant amount compared to the amount that's recorded of anybody else. Syncletica's sayings were very well preserved. And you have various different figures. I'll just run through. Hey, Melissa, great to see you jumping on there. We're just talking about the Desert Mothers today, and we've got, we've made an exciting announcement in the last week or so that we've just released 5 new devotionals based on the lives of the Desert Mothers. We've had our devotionals based on the lives of the Desert Fathers, and I've been working on this project. The Desert Fathers have been working on as a project for the last 10 years almost, but the Desert Mothers one, we've been collating it and putting it together for the last 3 years or so, and we've finally gotten to the point where we can put it out. So you can find, just running through a list of names of significant influential women. You've got Theodora the nun. She was one in the 4th to the 5th century. One of the things that was most notable about Theodora was she fled from some situation, but we don't exactly know what that situation is because history doesn't tell us. She flees from some situation. She'd fallen into sin, or something had happened to her, and she flees into the desert, and she ends up disguising herself as a man to join a monastic community because it was the only place she could find. And so Theodora lives in the community for the better part of a decade before passing away. and she is, she's fools everybody. They all think that she's a man, and it's not until she passes away that they find out she was a woman. Now with Theodora, one of the things that happened to her in her life was she went on an errand with one of the other brothers in the monastery, not knowing that Theodora is a woman, um, and stays in a stable in the city that they go to get some supplies. And she is accused by a local woman in the city of impregnating her, which is obviously impossible for Theodora to do. But the woman was looking for a scapegoat to show to say this is the person that got me pregnant. And so Theodora didn't defend herself. She is far, and this is very common in the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers tradition, was the idea that um, Christ himself didn't defend himself when he stood in front of Pontius Pilate, when he stood in front of the Sanhedrin, and when he was on the cross. He turned the other cheek, and that was his teaching. And so when Theodora is accused, she does just that. She turns the other cheek. She doesn't defend herself. When this other woman has the baby, Theodora takes the baby as her own and raises it as her son. And it's not until she passes away, I believe it's the bishop of the monastery where she lives, has a dream the night that Theodora passed away, and he sees the monk that Theodosius, I think she was known by, sees the monk Theodosius going, and the angels say, "That's not Theodosius, that's Theodora." And that's when he realizes that she's a woman. And so, sure enough, they find out when they bury her body that she's a woman. Um, and so that's the story of Theodora. And Theodora is one of the three women that are included in the sayings of the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers. You've got Amasera, another woman who, one of the most notable things said about her was that she lived by a river and she never once looked in the reflection of the river. Because for the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers, dealing with vanity was quite the thing. And so to look upon your reflection was to look in order to admire. And so yeah, it was a significant thing that Sarah never looked at a reflection in the river, because she never succumbed to vanity. That's the whole point. She lived there for 60 years. And Sarah's another one who was part of the collection of sayings as well, counted right there with the men. And she was just, her teachings are just incredible. Now with Sarah, we only have about a page and a half worth of what she taught to try and reproduce, and that makes it a little bit more difficult to put together a consistent, this is what Sarah taught and this is how she approached the spiritual life. It is easier to do it with the men, because you can get someone like Basil the Great, who wrote the rules, the long rules and the short rules of the monastic life, the way that monastic life was ordered in Turkey. And so there's a lot that he wrote that we can pull from. With Sarah, I mean, we might have a page and a half. So we try and recreate the figure of Sarah and what stood out to her as important in the spiritual life. And one of the stories that's told about her is that for 13 years she struggled with a temptation to lust, specifically in the story called the demon of fornication. So for 13 years she's struggling with these lustful thoughts that's personified in this demonic figure. And at the end of this 13-year struggle, the demonic figure appears to her in the flesh in front of her and says, "Oh, what, Sarah, do you think that you've conquered me?" And Sarah says, "I have not conquered you, but Christ has conquered you." And she gives us some real interesting instruction with that particular statement, which rings true with what the fathers taught as well, is the way to overcome um, thoughts that would distract you or seek to overwhelm you, whether they're lustful thoughts, prideful thoughts, thoughts of vengeance, greed, whatever, is not so much to battle against the thought itself, but the battle is to the battle's not here with this thought. The battle is to turn my heart from the thought. It's not the conflict in front of me, but the conflict is actually raising my heart to Christ, that he fights on my behalf. So her example is very instructive in that sense, and very helpful in that sense too. But I find the instruction of the Desert Fathers on how to deal with the thought life to be um, uh, basically without compare to what we have today. Because really the idea is that don't fight your thoughts. They're too powerful for you because they're inspired by forces that are beyond your control. So don't fight your thoughts, fight to get your heart centered in Christ and turn towards him and let him fight for you. And that's what Sarah did, and that's the example of Sarah, and why it's so instructive. There's another example is a nun named Isadora. And Isadora was she joined a monastic community for women, and she dedicated herself. Well, she worked in the kitchen. She did all that she could to serve in the kitchen, and cooked and cleaned. And she kind of feigned um, senility, if you will. And she's part of what's called in historic Christianity, in the monastic tradition, she's what people called a fool for Christ. And so while she was brilliant, she pretended like she was not, in order to just kind of fade into the background and serve and love and give her life as service to the women around her. And what happens in the midst of this with Isadora is one of the I think who was it? I'm just trying to remember. I've got some notes. I'm trying to remember who was. I can't remember. There was one of the desert fathers of the day had a moment with the Lord where the Lord told him to go to the convent where Isadora was. No, he didn't. Nobody knew Isadora. Nobody knew that she was anything significant at that time. And showed him the woman that he was to pray for and say, that he showed her the woman that was to bless him, that he was supposed to say, "You're to bless me, mother, bless me." And an angel shows up to him and gives this particular Abba instruction that says, "Go to this." Melissa, for sure, it could be used in a Bible study group for women. I'll show you the books in just a second. So the Abba has this moment. The angel says, "Go to the convent. I'm going to show you a particular woman there, and I want that woman to bless you." And so the man goes. It was okay. I've got it written there. It's Pitterun was the name of the Abba Pitterun. And so he's looking. All of the women come out, but they never ever think about bringing Isadora out because she's just kind of the crazy lady that serves in the kitchen. And so they bring all the other women out, and Pitterun's going, "No, it's not her. It's not her. The Lord didn't show me her. Didn't show me her. No, it's not her. It's not her." Until finally, all of the women are brought out in front of Pitterun, and he says, "No, this isn't the one that the Lord showed me." And finally, they say, "Well, the only one that's left is Isadora, but she's the crazy lady in the kitchen." And so he says, "Well, bring her to me." So she comes out, and Pitterun falls at her feet, and because he recognizes this is the one the Lord showed me, and he says, "Mother, bless me." And she says, "No, I can't do that. You bless me." And all the women are stunned because they've thought this is just the crazy lady. There's nothing special about her, without realizing that she's actually feigned, uh, senility, so that she can remain anonymous and just serve the Lord. And it says in the story, actually, they'd taken it out on her. Actually, they'd done some pretty nasty and mean things to her. And so she was the lowest of the low, and Pitterun recognizes her and esteems her. And the next day, all the women are just so deferential to her, where they've mistreated her before. They're so deferential to her that she ends up leaving, and we don't know what happened to her after that. She disappears from the history books. And I love the stories of the Desert Mothers and the Desert Fathers, for that matter, and the fact that they did not want recognition for anything that they did. Yeah, and that was Isadora. Brilliant woman who lived her life in service and fled at the first sign that she was going to be recognized as something. Whereas today we run towards recognition, then they fled recognition. I love that. So then, as I said, we talked about millennia, the elder. Yeah, it's the opposite, as Brenda says, the opposite of most of us today. Millennia, the elder, influential. If you missed some of that, we talked about that earlier in the broadcast. Millennia, the younger. There's a woman named Pelagia. Pelagia was an interesting one. She was a well-known dancer and an actress. She was kind of like your a woman who, at the height of her game in Hollywood today, where everybody recognizes as one of the most beautiful women in the world, and everybody wants to go watch a movie that she's in. Pelagia was basically that, in the sense of being a dancer and an actress in the plays of the day. And so she was well known, right? And there's this one moment where we see the Bishop Nonus, who writes about Pelagia, that Nonus watches Pelagia come through. The bishops are gathered in a particular location, Nonus being one of them. And Pelagia comes through with all of her retinue following her, all of her adoring fans, all of this. And she's just dressed to the nines, she's done up, everything. And Nonus, all the bishops, not nuns, all the bishops avert their gaze, because they're ashamed when the beauty of Pelagia walks by. Like, we're not going to look at this woman. She's a dancing girl. She's a sinner, all this stuff. And Nonus just watches in fascination as Pelagia walks by. And all the bishops are like, Bishop Nonus, how could you do that? And Bishop Nonus says this: my goodness, do you think about the amount of time she took to prepare her beauty for everybody to see her? And we can't even take 5 minutes to prepare our soul to see Jesus. And it's like, oh man. So you hear these things, you're just like, whoa. So, anyway, so Pelagia ends up, or Nonus has a dream. The next day, next night, he has a dream. And in the dream, a dove flies into the sanctuary of the church where he's preaching, and it's covered in soot. It's dirty, and it flies right up to Bishop Nonus, and Nonus takes the dove, cleans it off gently, and the dove is none the worse for the wear. And the dove is this beautiful, white, outstanding dove. And that's the dream. And so Nonus is kind of contemplating this. What does this dream mean? And later that day, he's in the church and he's preaching, and it just so happens that Pelagia walks by as he's preaching, and she sneaks into the back of the church, and she's struck by what Nonus is preaching about, which I don't know what he was preaching about, but she's struck by it, and she's touched by the Holy Spirit. She leaves and sends word to Nonus afterwards and asks if she can come meet with him, and he's like, it would be very beyond decorum for him to do that, but he agrees. She comes and tells him the story, so he connects Pelagia with a group of women who begin teaching her and training her. And eventually Pelagia feels the need to leave the city because she's so well known. Her name's not actually Pelagia. That's the name she took. So she leaves and flees into the desert and takes on the name of a man, Pelagius, and puts herself in a cell that she'll never open the door of. And she took on the name of a man because, as a man living alone in the wilderness where there were robbers and barbarians and bandits and things like that, it was a bit, to have the reputation as being a man there as opposed to a woman was a much better thing, because if you were a woman living there, they would come take advantage of you. So she's Pelagius, never opens a door, and everybody begins coming to her for wisdom. For about 20 years, she lives out there and becomes incredibly influential in the context of where she is. And it's not until she passes away where they open up the cell to get her body and to go have a funeral, because she's become so enamored of the people that they're going to have this huge ceremony for her life, because they want to remember her. She was so influential that people from hundreds of miles away would come to listen to her teach and her wisdom, not knowing that it was Pelagia, the woman, who was the dancing model actress. But this is what they're thinking is Pelagius, the man. And so they find out when they bring her body out that it's actually a woman. And then Nonus says, this is Pelagia. And they're stunned that this has happened, right? And so Pelagia becomes incredibly influential. So, and we could just keep going on. There's Olympias, who is a woman that becomes the deacon of the Church of Chrysostom in Rome. She's called the glory of the widows of the Eastern Church. Very close friends with John Chrysostom, who was obviously an incredibly influential early theologian, very, very close friends with Gregory Nazianzen and Basil the Great, two other Cappadocian fathers who were significant when it comes to the formation, or not the formation of, but kind of giving us language for how we think about and talk about the Trinity. So another one dies from a wealthy family, commits her life to a life of monasticism. She becomes a leader in the Church of Rome, right alongside John Chrysostom. So amazing woman. You have Matrona. We talked about Matrona a little bit. Macrina, another one. Macrina was the older sister of Gregory of Nyssa and Basil the Great. Very Basil the Great and Gregory of Nyssa were again Cappadocian fathers with Gregory Nazianzen, and she's credited by both Gregory of Nyssa and Basil the Great as having taught them much as it pertains to the spiritual life. So you've got Alma Marcella of Rome. We talked about her. Alma Paula was another one. Paula, Paula. Another one that was a contemporary of Saint Jerome and helped him translate the Latin Bible. Hey, Annette, it's great to see you. Paula was instrumental in debating theological issues. Her and Jerome would go toe to toe on certain things. She's considered as one of the greatest minds of her age. And you've got Alma Susan was another one who actually committed her life to a monastic life around the age of 8. There's another very famous story in church history of Mary the Harlot, a woman who was known as a seducer and would purposefully try and seduce Christians to win them away from Jesus, ends up being touched by the tenderness of his heart. Once she can't go in, she actually tries to walk into a church and she's barred by a physical force, falls on her face weeping, and the tenderness of Christ speaks to her, and she goes to the desert. And 20 plus years later, she's found by a man named Abba Zosimus, who tells her story in some of his writings. So just and her story became just a touching point for women that had been full of shame, who had done things that they regret. So her story became just very widely circulated because it was such a point of healing for people to hear about how Mary encountered Jesus and was purified and cleansed of the previous life that was marked by sin and just wanton lust in her life. And then again, like we said, Syncletica. I mentioned Syncletica earlier. Syncletica, the teachings of Syncletica were written by Athanasius, or someone penning the name underneath the name of Athanasius. Athanasius wrote her life and her teachings. And I've got there's a book up there, up in that little stretch up there. Is that working now? Microphone just lost power. I think it's probably working now. Hello. Maybe, I hope so. The sound, is it back? Hello. I'm hoping the sound is back. No, not back. There, okay. Sometimes it gets a bit finicky. So, okay, great. Sometimes I hit the mic and hit the cables and it messes it up. So Syncletica, another one who's was writing. She wrote it's about 80 pages worth of teaching that's kind of a consistent, this is how we work through the spiritual life. One of the things I love about Syncletica is she talks about how when someone at the outset of the spiritual life, when they're immature, what the devil tries to do to impact them or to mess with them is to remind them of all their faults. For the immature, he reminds them of all their faults. And so she says the strategy that we need to employ when we're mentoring people that are immature is to remind them of the grace of God and the tenderness of his heart. And then she says, but for the mature, what the devil tries to do is remind them of the grace of God and the tenderness of his heart and cause them to forget their faults. And so she says, what we need to do with those that are mature is we need to make sure they remember that they have faults. And so I love how simple she looks at it and goes, the mature ones need to remember they're not perfect, and God does love them, but they're not perfect. The immature ones need to remember, because they know they're imperfect, God loves them. So I love how beautiful that, just the simplicity of that is. That's one of the things that really stands out to me about Syncletica. So we've put together, and this is kind of the final part of our broadcast today, we put together 5 devotionals based on the lives of these women. So I'll just put them up one by one so you can see them. We've got Alma Theodora, the woman who was falsely accused and lived her life with that false accusation. 7 days worth of her principles from her life and then I write about it, and there's prayers that are inspired by the sayings of these women. There's Syncletica, Alma Syncletica, where 7 days again, the teachings of Alma Syncletica and some of the writings that we've written, and then teachings or prayers to pray. And each day is each day. Just for those of you that have seen the Desert Fathers ones, very similar. So each day will have day 2 will have a scripture reference that kind of undergirds the spiritual principle of the day, and like Syncletica, she says for day 2, the quote is, "Those who practice poverty gain a great benefit, for by not focusing their mind on treasure here on earth, they are putting on the kingdom of heaven." And so then we have a writing about that to try and help you think through that or just apply that, and a prayer that you can just dwell on. Alma Macrina is another one. And so the teachings of Alma Macrina are herein recreated. Macrina wrote, when her brother Basil the Great passed away, she wrote back and forth with Gregory the Great, or Gregory of Nyssa, a book called On the Soul. And she was very instructive to Gregory about, he was dealing with deep grief from his brother having passed away. And so Macrina was very instructive to him, to help him deal with the grief. And Alma Mary the harlot, and her story of going into the desert, and she retells her story. And so we've just done we still have good. Okay, I just hit the thing, so I'll make sure we still have sound. So Mary, she tells her story about going through, going into the desert, and the principles that she has, that she lived out. And then Alma Sarah as well, the one who lived by the river for 60 years and never once looked in it, and what she taught. So there's these 5 are now available. You can find them. The link is in the video description. And you know what? I was just thinking, let me show you guys something. For anybody that is, while supplies last, give me just a sec. We've just put together, we're sending these out. Some of you that have ordered a book from us in the past or attended a course in the last year or two, you're going to get one of these in the mail. That's a spoiler alert. But we've just put these out, these Christmas gifts we're sending out to people that are donors and supporters, and people that have been following and tracking with us, that kind of stuff. These little Christmas devotionals. So 10 days with the church fathers, looking at the writings of Maximus the Great and Leo the Great on the nature of the incarnation, and how incredible it was that the divinity of God assumed our humanity in order to redeem our humanity. And so these little short booklets are going out in the next day or so. But I'm just thinking, if you order the set of 5, which you can find on the link of the video description, I'll put in the comments as well. Maybe you might find one of these while supplies last in the collection. So the set is there. The books themselves are $12 each, or you get the set for $50. So you get one of them free if you buy the whole set. So I'll put a link to the shop here in the chat if you want to check them out. But my prayer is that they be inspirational, especially to people who, there's a number of women that I know my wife has said a number of times. We've been involved in lots of ministry training and teaching, and she's often left feeling like, I wish there was, she at one point, I remember her saying at one point, just to hammer this point home, I'm so tired of sports analogies for the spiritual life. And it was a commentary on how many times we had great men come and teach, but she was like, when can we have a woman come and teach? And it just seems like it can be few and far between sometimes. And so my real heart with this is that people like my wife would find women that would inspire them, because we know there's tons of men that will inspire us, and we're going to keep talking about that. We've been talking about that. I mean, you're getting a 10 days with the church fathers with two of the great men in Christian history when you order the thing. So, but I just wanted to help highlight, yes, women have been an integral part of Christian history, the formation of theology, and the practice of teaching in church history. So that's what those are for. If you're interested at all, the link is there in the chat and it's in the video description. And I am tomorrow leaving for Texas early in the morning. I'll be in Texas for a week and a half. So anybody that's around the streams guys in Dallas, I'll be there this coming weekend and next weekend. I will actually be at a friend's church in Shreveport on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So I'm going to be around just a little bit. So follow us on social media. I'm sure you'll get updates on all that kind of stuff about what we're doing. So I'm looking forward to seeing some of you guys while I'm on the road. And then when I get back, we're going to be relaunching the Dream Show. So yes, been great to see everybody jumping on. Take a second and share the video feed. It could be these will be great. They come in this nice little box with the Wind logo on it. So you'll get a box to put them in. Be a great Christmas gift for your friends. So once again, I'll flash them up here one more time. And there you go. He's great. So we'll catch you guys on a later video. And it's been wonderful spending some time with you guys on this Thursday afternoon. So good to see some of you we haven't seen in a little while. We'll get back to more consistent live streaming pretty quick here. So blessings, everybody. And until next time.